The classroom was silent except for the soft scratching of pencils against paper. Jamal sat at his desk, his fingers drumming nervously on the edge of his test booklet. He could feel the weight of every eye in the room, but he didn't dare look up. His teacher, Mr. Thompson, was pacing the front of the class, watching every student closely. Jamal's mind raced, his thoughts were a whirlwind of doubts and fears. "All right, class," Mr. Thompson said, his voice sharp and commanding. "You have 1 hour to complete the test. No talking, no cheating. And for those of you who think you can't handle this, I suggest you give it your best effort anyway." Jamal's stomach tightened at Mr. Thompson's words. He wasn't sure if it was the pressure of the test itself, or the weight of the teacher's subtle skepticism. Either way, Jamal had a feeling that this test would be more than just about grades. It felt like a moment that could change everything. The test wasn't just about math problems or science equations, it was about proving something to everyone in the room, especially to Mr. Thompson, who had always looked at him as if he was just another kid from the wrong side of town. Jamal's fingers hovered over the first question. He had studied for weeks, poring over textbooks and notes late into the night, but now, in the quiet of the classroom, with the pressure mounting by the second, nothing seemed to make sense. Was this all enough? Was he smart enough to do well? Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. Jamal remembered reading a meme on social media that morning. A joke about facing challenges and pushing through them, no matter how impossible things seemed. It felt like a silly distraction, but right now, it gave him a tiny sliver of hope. This story might just spark a new beginning, the meme had said. Jamal clung to that thought as he pushed the doubt out of his mind, focusing on the test in front of him. His eyes skimmed the first problem again. A complicated algebraic equation. Jamal knew how to solve it. He had done problems like this hundreds of times. But now, sitting there, with everyone watching and the clock ticking away, the numbers seemed to swirl into a blur. The familiar steps to solve the equation felt foreign, almost out of reach. He closed his eyes for a moment, steadying his breath. "Focus, Jamal," he told himself. "Just breathe. You know this." He picked up his pencil again, his hand shaking slightly, and began scribbling numbers across the page. The room seemed to grow quieter, even though he knew everyone else was working just as hard. Every time he heard a page turn or someone sigh in frustration, it made his heart race even faster. Why did he feel like the whole world was watching him? Jamal's mind flickered back to last year, to the conversations he'd overheard between Mr. Thompson and the other teachers. It wasn't a secret that Mr. Thompson didn't believe Jamal was cut out for advanced work. His grades were good, better than most of the students, but they weren't perfect. And that, apparently, was enough for Mr. Thompson to dismiss him as just another kid who would never make it out of the neighborhood. Jamal had heard it all. "Not everyone is cut out for success," Mr. Thompson had said to a colleague once, his voice filled with that same quiet, skeptical tone. "Some students are just not there yet." That moment had stung Jamal more than anything. He wasn't just another kid. He had something to prove. The teacher's dismissive attitude had never been louder than it was now. Mr. Thompson walked slowly past Jamal's desk, his eyes glancing at the paper for only a split second. That was all it took. The look Mr. Thompson gave him, like he was measuring Jamal's worth based on some unspoken expectation, made Jamal's blood boil. "Take your time, Jamal," Mr. Thompson said, not unkindly, but with a tone that carried a subtle undercurrent of doubt. "We all know how these tests can be a little tricky, don't we?" Jamal bit his lip. He could feel the teacher's eyes lingering a little longer than necessary. Was it pity? Was it judgment? He couldn't tell. But Jamal knew one thing for sure, he was about to change everything. He couldn't let Mr. Thompson, or anyone else for that matter, define him by their narrow perceptions. He was more than the stereotypes. He was more than the struggles he'd faced. He was more than the neighborhood that shaped him. Jamal was going to show them all, show them that he had something special. Something that had always been there, waiting to break free. The room was silent again, save for the faint rustling of papers, and Jamal's pencil scratching steadily across his test. The doubts began to fade, slowly but surely. He solved the first problem, then the next, and the next. Each answer came more easily than the last, as if his brain had been waiting for the right moment to spring into action. Soon, Jamal was in the zone, lost in the rhythm of the test, blocking out everything around him. For the first time in weeks, he felt in control. He was no longer overwhelmed by the pressure. It felt good to finally trust in his own abilities, even if the world around him didn't. The last problem was a monster, an equation so complex that Jamal's heart skipped a beat. But he didn't hesitate. He wrote down his first steps, then followed the process, breaking it down methodically. The answer appeared before him, simple and clear. Time was almost up. He looked up, glancing around at the other students. Some were scribbling down answers frantically, others were still stuck on the first few questions. Jamal looked at his own test, every question had been answered. His heart raced as he handed it to Mr. Thompson, his hand trembling slightly. But it wasn't from fear. It was from something else. Something new. As he took his seat again, Jamal sat back and exhaled slowly, allowing himself a brief moment of relief. He wasn't sure how the test would turn out, but one thing was for sure, he had done his best. No matter what happened next, he knew he had pushed through the doubts. He had proven to himself that he was capable of much more than anyone had ever imagined. But little did Jamal know, this test would be just the beginning. What came next would be nothing short of life-changing. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Jamal had never been one to talk much about where he came from. To most people, his neighborhood was just a backdrop, a place where too many dreams were crushed before they ever had a chance to grow. But to Jamal, it was more than just the cracked sidewalks and rundown houses. It was home. He grew up in a small apartment on the second floor of a building on the outskirts of the city. His mom, Tamara, worked as a nurse at the local hospital, pulling long hours to make sure Jamal and his little sister, Aaliyah, had everything they needed. She was the one who kept everything together, even when things seemed like they were falling apart. Jamal never got to see much of his father. His dad had left when he was barely old enough to remember his face, leaving behind a stack of broken promises and empty words. But Tamara never let him feel like he was missing anything. She was strong, fiercely protective, and always determined to show her kids that there was more to life than what they saw on the streets. "You've got to work harder than everyone else to get what you want, Jamal," she'd tell him every night as they sat together at the kitchen table. "And always remember, no one can take your mind from you. It's your most powerful weapon." She'd sit across from him, wiping her tired hands on her apron, while Jamal did his homework. Sometimes, she'd help him with his assignments, her mind working just as hard as his, even though she was exhausted. "You can do anything," she'd remind him. "But you've got to believe in yourself." But believing in yourself when the whole world seemed to be telling you that you didn't matter was no easy feat. Jamal didn't talk much at school. He kept to himself, his head down, lost in his work. The other kids didn't really pay attention to him, and he preferred it that way. It was easier to fade into the background than to stand out. He was used to being underestimated. After all, he was just another kid from the wrong side of town. A place where hope seemed like a foreign concept, and expectations were lower than the streetlights that flickered every night on his block. But Jamal knew better than to let those expectations define him. He saw the world differently. Even though he didn't talk much, he was always thinking, always calculating, always dreaming. In his mind, he was already somewhere else, a place far away from the rundown buildings and the noise of the city. He had big dreams. Dreams bigger than anything the world around him could offer. And then there was Aaliyah, his little sister. Jamal couldn't help but smile when he thought about her. Aaliyah was everything Jamal wasn't. She was loud, full of energy, and always the center of attention. Her laugh could fill a room, and she had a way of making even the dullest moments feel special. Despite her bubbly personality, Aaliyah had her own struggles. The neighborhood wasn't kind to little girls like her, but Jamal promised himself that he would protect her. He would get them both out of there, no matter what it took. But Tamara was the anchor. She was the one who held it all together, and Jamal knew that whatever his future held, he couldn't let her down. She sacrificed so much for him, and the least he could do was work hard to make her proud. Yet, no matter how hard Jamal worked, it always seemed like there was a limit to how far he could go. No matter how many good grades he got, there was always someone, usually a teacher or a counselor, who would pull him aside and tell him that he had potential, but that he should be realistic. It wasn't just the schools, either. Jamal heard it in the community, from people who thought he was smart for a kid from his neighborhood, but that was about as far as it ever went. They'd look at him like a story with no ending, and Jamal couldn't stand it. At home, things weren't any easier. The apartment was small, and the walls were thin. Sometimes, Jamal would lie in bed late at night, staring up at the ceiling, wondering if things would always be this way. He thought about the kids who made fun of him at school, the ones who would whisper behind his back, calling him the quiet kid or the brainiac, like it was some kind of insult. He wondered if he was ever going to escape the labels people put on him. But his mother's voice always brought him back. "Don't listen to them, Jamal," she'd say, brushing his hair from his forehead when he was little. "You're not what they say you are. You're everything you decide to be." Even now, in his teenage years, those words rang in his ears every time he felt like giving up. They were a constant reminder that he wasn't defined by what others thought of him. He wasn't just another kid from a rough neighborhood. He was Jamal. And Jamal had something the world didn't know about yet. As Jamal sat at his desk that day in Mr. Thompson's class, his thoughts wandered back to the dreams he had. He wanted more than what this small town had to offer. He wanted to prove that he wasn't just a statistic. He wanted to show the world that people like him, people from backgrounds like his, could rise above the noise and do something extraordinary. And he was going to prove it. Not just to everyone else, but to himself. But proving it wasn't going to be easy. Jamal knew that better than anyone. There would be people who tried to hold him back, people who thought they knew him better than he knew himself. He had already seen it in the eyes of his teachers, and he knew Mr. Thompson was no different. It was going to take more than just working hard. It was going to take the kind of effort that would leave a mark on everyone around him. Jamal wasn't just going to succeed, he was going to shock them all. He had the potential, the drive, and the belief. All he needed now was the chance to show the world what he was capable of. And that was exactly what he was going to do. The bell rang, signaling the end of the test. Jamal could feel the tension in the room lift, but it didn't leave him feeling relieved. Instead, it made him anxious. He had turned in his paper already, but there was a gnawing uncertainty gnawing at him. What if it wasn't enough? What if Mr. Thompson didn't believe he could do it? Jamal's palms were sweating as he sat back down in his seat, trying to steady his breathing. His mind was racing with 1,000 possibilities. He glanced around the room, noticing the other students fidgeting, some handing their tests over quickly, others still working furiously to finish. Mr. Thompson was at the front of the class, his face set in its usual expression of mild disinterest, but Jamal could tell he was scrutinizing the tests, giving each one his full attention. He always did, but with Jamal, it felt like there was more than just the usual grading going on. "All right, class. I'll have your results back by tomorrow," Mr. Thompson announced, his voice devoid of emotion. "In the meantime, you're free to go." As the students shuffled out of the room, Jamal stood up, gathering his things slowly. His hands were still trembling, a mixture of nerves and anticipation. He wanted to get out of the classroom as fast as possible, but something tugged at him, urging him to wait. When he reached the door, he turned, hesitating for a moment, then walked back toward Mr. Thompson's desk. The teacher was flipping through papers, but when Jamal approached, Mr. Thompson's eyes flicked up. His gaze, ever so slightly critical, scanned Jamal, making him feel like the object of a study. For a moment, there was silence between them, the weight of everything Jamal had been feeling pressing down on him. "Jamal," Mr. Thompson said, his voice low but pointed. "You seem to be getting better. I'm not sure if it's enough to move up to the advanced class, but, we'll see." His words hung in the air like an unspoken judgment. Jamal felt a sharp sting in his chest. Better? He wasn't just getting better. He had worked his hardest, sacrificed time he could have spent with his family or just relaxing, pouring every ounce of his energy into those textbooks and practice problems. But to Mr. Thompson, it was still just getting better. His stomach twisted as he struggled to hold back his frustration. "I'll be back tomorrow, Mr. Thompson," Jamal said quietly, nodding before turning to leave the room. But as he reached the door, he stopped. He could feel Mr. Thompson's gaze following him, a mixture of pity and condescension. It made his blood boil. Walking down the hall, Jamal's mind was in overdrive. This is it. This is exactly what I've been talking about. The doubt that Mr. Thompson had always cast on him, the expectation that he wasn't good enough, was about to become a reality. Jamal's fists clenched, his jaw tight. He could feel the anger building inside him. How was he supposed to prove everyone wrong if no one ever gave him the chance? He wanted to scream, but instead, he kept walking. His mom's words echoed in his head, "You've got to work harder than everyone else to get what you want." She was right. Jamal had to prove himself, not just to Mr. Thompson but to the world. And to do that, he needed more than just good grades. He needed to show them that he was capable of greatness, even when they didn't believe in him. But the truth was, Jamal wasn't sure how much longer he could keep pushing. It felt like every time he made progress, someone would find a reason to doubt him. He had fought hard to earn his place, but no matter what he did, he still felt like he was fighting an uphill battle. The next day, as Jamal walked into the classroom, he noticed the test papers were already on his desk. His heart skipped a beat as he sat down, eyes immediately scanning the red marks on the paper. He'd gotten most of the answers right, but there were a few mistakes, ones that stung, ones that felt like missed opportunities. The grade at the top wasn't terrible, but it wasn't a perfect score either. It was a B+. Jamal let out a long breath, trying to control his reaction. A B+ wasn't bad, he knew that. But it wasn't enough. Not by a long shot. Not if he wanted to prove himself, not if he wanted to move up to the advanced class. His eyes flicked to Mr. Thompson, who was standing at the front of the class, waiting for everyone to take their seats. "All right, class, let's get started," Mr. Thompson said, his tone a little colder than usual. He was already scanning the room, making quick notes on a clipboard, his focus sharp. Jamal couldn't shake the feeling that Mr. Thompson was looking at him like he was a problem, something that needed to be fixed. It made his heart sink. But Jamal wasn't going to let that stop him. He refused to let Mr. Thompson's doubt define him. No, he was going to push forward, no matter what. He had to. His mind was already racing with ideas for how he could improve, how he could rise above the limitations that were constantly being placed on him. He couldn't let anyone make him feel like he wasn't worthy of the opportunities that others took for granted. As the day wore on, Jamal found himself growing more and more determined. He couldn't change the past, but he could control what came next. He could prove everyone wrong. "I'll show them," he thought, "just wait and see." He spent the rest of the day in a daze, the wheels in his mind turning, plotting his next move. The tests, the doubts, the expectations, they were just hurdles in his way. He would overcome them, just like he had overcome everything else. By the time the school day ended, Jamal had already made a decision. He wasn't going to let Mr. Thompson's doubt, or anyone else's, hold him back. He was going to take control of his future. He was going to fight for his place, even if he had to fight alone. And this time, he wasn't going to stop until everyone saw who he really was. The following week, Jamal arrived at school with a renewed sense of purpose. His mind was sharper, more focused than ever before. He had made a decision. He wasn't just going to let things happen to him. He was going to take charge of his destiny. And the first step in that direction? Proving that he was more than what others saw. His thoughts were swirling as he walked through the crowded hallways, barely noticing the conversations happening around him. The typical chaos of students rushing between classes, the chatter, the clatter of lockers opening and closing, it all felt like distant noise. All Jamal could think about was his next move. It wasn't going to be easy. He knew that. But the more he thought about it, the more certain he became. His path wasn't going to be defined by people like Mr. Thompson. It was going to be defined by his actions, his choices, and most importantly, his ability to rise above the limitations others placed on him. The test results were just one part of the picture. It was a wake-up call, a sign that things needed to change. Jamal couldn't keep doing the same thing and expecting a different result. He had to go above and beyond. And this time, he wasn't going to wait for the world to catch up with him. He was going to make the world notice him. The first step was taking his studies seriously, more seriously than ever before. He had always been a good student, but Jamal knew that if he wanted to stand out, he needed to push himself beyond his comfort zone. He needed to find a way to prove that he had the genius IQ that people kept overlooking. So, every night, after dinner, Jamal began to study like never before. It wasn't just about completing assignments or memorizing formulas. It was about truly understanding the material. He devoured textbooks, watched online lectures, and pored over past tests, dissecting every question to figure out how to improve. It was exhausting, but Jamal didn't care. This was his future, and he was going to fight for it. But it wasn't just the academic side that Jamal was focusing on. He also knew that he had to push himself socially. He couldn't afford to be invisible anymore. So, he started to speak up more in class, even when it felt uncomfortable. He asked questions, made suggestions, and offered answers, even if he wasn't always sure they were the best ones. Every time he opened his mouth, he felt a little more confident. Slowly, the other students began to notice him. And then, there was the hardest part, confronting Mr. Thompson. Jamal knew he had to have a conversation with his teacher. He couldn't let Mr. Thompson's doubt continue to weigh on him. But every time Jamal thought about speaking up, something held him back. What if he was wrong? What if Mr. Thompson was right, and Jamal wasn't cut out for the advanced class? But no. Jamal refused to let fear dictate his future. He had worked too hard to let it all slip away now. On the morning of the next class, Jamal sat in his seat early, his fingers tapping nervously on the desk. He didn't want to wait any longer. As the bell rang and the students trickled in, he felt a wave of determination wash over him. This was the moment. Mr. Thompson stood at the front of the class, scanning over his lesson plan. Jamal took a deep breath, then stood up. The room seemed to fall silent as the other students turned to look at him. He could feel all eyes on him, and for a brief moment, he was paralyzed by the pressure. But then he thought of his mom, of Aaliyah, of all the people who had believed in him. He couldn't back down now. Mr. Thompson, Jamal said, his voice steady despite the butterflies in his stomach. I want to talk about my future in this class. Mr. Thompson looked up, his expression unreadable. Go ahead, Jamal. What's on your mind? Jamal took a deep breath, his heart pounding. I know you have some doubts about me. You said I was getting better, but that's not enough. I'm not just trying to get by. I want to be in the advanced class. I want to prove that I can do it, that I belong there. I need your help. The class was silent as Jamal spoke, the weight of his words hanging in the air. For a moment, Mr. Thompson said nothing. He just stared at Jamal, as if trying to decide how to respond. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Mr. Thompson nodded. "Jamal, I respect your determination. But this isn't about just working harder. You need to show me that you have the capacity to excel in this class. The advanced work is challenging, and not everyone can handle it." Jamal stood tall, his eyes locked on his teacher's. "I can handle it. I know I can. I just need the chance to prove it." Mr. Thompson studied him for a long moment, and for the first time in a long time, Jamal saw a flicker of something in his eyes, perhaps respect, perhaps curiosity. "I'll give you a chance," Mr. Thompson said finally. "You'll have to prove yourself. But if you can keep up with the workload and demonstrate your understanding, I'll consider moving you up." Jamal's heart soared. This was it, the opportunity he had been waiting for. "Thank you," he said, his voice filled with determination. "I won't let you down." As he sat back down, the other students seemed to relax, and the room returned to its usual chatter. But Jamal couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. This was the turning point. He had taken control of his own future, and now, the real work began. That night, Jamal stayed up late, studying harder than ever. He wasn't just going to pass, he was going to ace every test, every assignment, every project. He wasn't going to let anyone doubt him again. This was his journey now, and he was going to see it through to the end. The weeks that followed were nothing short of intense. Jamal was pushing himself harder than he ever had before. Every morning, he would wake up at 5 a.m. to get in a couple of hours of studying before school. In between classes, he would review his notes, asking questions whenever he could, even when his classmates looked at him like he was crazy for working so hard. And when school ended, he would go home and spend hours in his room, books spread out on the floor, the glow of the lamp illuminating his face as he solved equations and memorized formulas. It wasn't easy. There were days when Jamal wanted to collapse from exhaustion. There were nights when he questioned whether he was doing the right thing, if all the sacrifice would really pay off. He missed spending time with his sister, Aaliyah. He missed the carefree moments that used to define his childhood. But he kept pushing forward, driven by a singular thought: I have to prove them wrong. Mr. Thompson's class had become Jamal's battleground. Every test, every quiz was a step closer to his goal. But with each passing day, Jamal felt more and more pressure. His classmates weren't making it easy, either. They started to whisper about him. Some even laughed when he answered a question too quickly or too accurately. They didn't get it. They didn't understand what it took for Jamal to get to this point. The hardest part wasn't the tests, though. It was dealing with the looks from Mr. Thompson. Every time Jamal thought he had made progress, every time he believed he was doing enough to prove himself, he saw the doubt in his teacher's eyes. He could feel the silent judgment. Mr. Thompson would give him a nod here, a small smile there, but there was never any praise. No recognition. The teacher still didn't quite believe. But Jamal wasn't backing down. He was determined to show Mr. Thompson that he had what it took to succeed, that his potential wasn't just some theory, it was real, and it was unstoppable. One Friday afternoon, Jamal sat in his usual seat, anxiously waiting for Mr. Thompson to hand back their latest test results. He had studied for this test like it was his life on the line, and in many ways, it felt like it was. He could feel the pressure building in his chest as he stared at the clock, counting the minutes until the bell would ring, signaling the end of the period. Finally, Mr. Thompson walked in, a stack of papers in his hands. Jamal's heart began to pound. He could see the red ink at the top of the papers. The teacher was already grading them, his focus sharp. The rest of the class was talking and joking around, but Jamal couldn't concentrate on anything except for the paper that would be placed on his desk. Mr. Thompson began handing back the tests, one by one. Jamal's palms grew clammy as he waited for his. His thoughts were racing. What if it's not enough? What if I didn't do well? What if I'm still not good enough for him? Then, at last, Jamal's test was placed on his desk. He took a deep breath before reaching for it, and his eyes immediately went to the grade at the top. A dash. He froze. A dash. For a moment, the room seemed to spin around him. It wasn't perfect, but it was close. It was the closest he had ever gotten to that elusive grade. It was validation. It was proof that all of his hard work, all of his sleepless nights, had paid off. But then Jamal felt a wave of emotion hit him. He wasn't just relieved. He was overwhelmed. All the pressure, all the doubts, all the sacrifices, it all hit him at once. The tears he had been holding back for so long began to well up in his eyes. For a moment, Jamal could barely see through the blur of tears. But he blinked them away quickly, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand before anyone could notice. He looked at the paper again. A dash. It wasn't perfect, but it was a breakthrough. For the first time, Jamal felt like he was finally being seen for who he really was. It wasn't just about the grade, it was about the acknowledgement, the recognition of the effort he had put in. And he knew that this was only the beginning. Mr. Thompson came around to check on each student as they looked over their tests. When he reached Jamal, he stopped for a moment longer than usual, his eyes scanning the paper. For a second, Jamal's heart skipped a beat, unsure of what Mr. Thompson would say. "You're improving, Jamal," Mr. Thompson said, his voice low but genuine. "Keep up the work. You've got potential." Jamal nodded, his throat tight. That was all he needed to hear. The praise might have been small, but it was enough to make everything feel worth it. It wasn't just the grade, it was the recognition. For the first time, Mr. Thompson saw him as more than just another student from the wrong side of town. He saw him as someone capable of greatness. As Jamal walked out of class that day, he felt a rush of accomplishment wash over him. The doubts had been there, nagging at him every step of the way. But now, there was no denying it. He had proven something to himself, and to the world. He wasn't just a kid from a broken neighborhood. He was Jamal, and he had something special. As he walked home, he couldn't help but smile. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was on the right path. The road ahead wasn't easy, and he knew there would be more challenges to face. But Jamal was no longer afraid of the obstacles. He was ready to face whatever came his way because he knew that he had the strength to overcome it. Jamal's journey was just beginning, and no one, no matter how much they doubted him, was going to stop him. The weeks following the test were a blur of studying, long nights, and small victories. Jamal had entered a rhythm, waking up early, dedicating hours after school to his homework, and soaking up every bit of knowledge he could. Every day, he felt his confidence growing, piece by piece. But despite all of this, there was still that lingering doubt that kept gnawing at him, especially whenever he thought about the final step, the moment he would prove to Mr. Thompson, and to himself, that he truly belonged in the advanced class. The pressure was mounting. The final test that would decide if Jamal would move up to the advanced class was approaching. It wasn't just any test, it was the hardest one yet. Jamal knew this would be the true test of his abilities. But for the first time, he didn't feel afraid. He felt prepared. By now, Jamal had learned to block out the noise. He had stopped worrying about what others thought of him, stopped listening to the whispers behind his back. The looks from his classmates, the doubts from his teacher, they didn't matter anymore. He was focused on one thing, success. But it wasn't just about the grade. Jamal had realized that. It was about proving to himself that he could rise above the obstacles. He had grown up with people telling him what he couldn't do, what he would never achieve. But now, Jamal had the chance to prove them all wrong. The night before the test, Jamal sat at his desk, staring at his notes. His mind was buzzing, but he wasn't feeling the usual anxiety. There was no panic this time. Just quiet determination. Aaliyah knocked on his door before peeking her head in. You still studying? She asked, her voice playful. Jamal looked up and smiled. Yeah, just trying to make sure I've got everything down. Tomorrow's the big one. Aaliyah raised an eyebrow. You've got this, right? I mean, you've been studying like crazy. I think so, Jamal replied, trying to sound confident. But inside, there was still that small, nagging fear of failure. He pushed it aside, focusing on the fact that he had already come so far. I've worked hard for this. Then go get them, Jamal, Aaliyah said, giving him a thumbs up before walking out. Jamal smiled at her encouragement, but the moment she left, he sat there for a while, looking at his textbooks. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain: he had given everything he had to this. There was nothing more he could do now except give it his all in that test tomorrow. And whatever the outcome, he would know that he had tried his best. The next day, Jamal walked into Mr. Thompson's class with a sense of purpose. The atmosphere in the room was different today. The usual hum of chatter and idle conversations was replaced by the low murmur of students quietly flipping through their notes. The test was about to begin. Mr. Thompson didn't waste time with pleasantries. He handed out the test papers, and Jamal felt a slight flutter in his stomach as he unfolded his sheet. It was a challenge, no doubt. But it wasn't just any challenge, it was his challenge. This was his chance to prove to Mr. Thompson, and to himself, that he was ready for the advanced class. Jamal worked through the test with a calm focus that surprised even him. He didn't rush, but he didn't second-guess himself either. The questions that once would have seemed impossible to him were now manageable. He attacked each problem with precision, recalling every formula, every technique he had worked so hard to master. For the first time in a long time, Jamal didn't feel out of place in the classroom. He felt like he belonged there. When the test was over, Jamal handed it in with a sense of relief. He couldn't change anything now, all he could do was wait. The anticipation of the results felt different this time. It wasn't just about the grade, it was about the journey. It had been grueling, yes, but it had also been empowering. The struggle had shaped him. The next day, as Jamal sat in class, the clock seemed to move at a glacial pace. Every minute felt like an hour, and every tick of the clock only added to the tension in the room. When Mr. Thompson finally began handing back the tests, Jamal's palms grew clammy. His heart raced as the teacher moved closer. Finally, Mr. Thompson placed Jamal's test on his desk. For a moment, Jamal just stared at the paper. His stomach twisted into knots. He reached for it, and his eyes immediately scanned the grade at the top. A. It was the grade he had been working for. The grade that symbolized everything he had worked for, his late nights, his sacrifices, his relentless drive. An A. Jamal felt his heart swell in his chest. He had done it. He had finally proven to everyone who had doubted him that he was capable of more. Not just capable of succeeding, but capable of excelling. Mr. Thompson walked over to Jamal's desk, nodding with an approving glance. I'll be recommending you for the advanced class, Jamal, he said quietly, but with a warmth in his voice that Jamal hadn't heard before. You've earned it. The weight of the words hit Jamal like a wave. For years, he had been trying to prove that he could be more, that he wasn't just a statistic, a stereotype, or a kid who would fall through the cracks. But now, Mr. Thompson saw him, not just as a student, but as someone who had worked hard to earn his place. As the class ended and Jamal walked out, he felt different. The world outside seemed brighter, the air a little fresher. For the first time, he wasn't just the kid who struggled to keep up. He was the kid who had overcome, who had risen above. The battle wasn't over. There would be more challenges ahead, more obstacles to overcome. But Jamal knew now that he had the strength to face them. He had proven to everyone who had ever doubted him that he was capable of greatness. And he had learned the most important lesson of all, that the greatest victory wasn't about being perfect, it was about never giving up, no matter how hard the road might seem. As he walked home that day, Jamal couldn't help but smile to himself. He had a long way to go, but for the first time, he truly believed in his own potential. The next few months passed in a whirlwind of new opportunities and challenges. Jamal had officially moved into the advanced class, and while the work was harder, it also felt more rewarding. Every problem he solved, every essay he wrote, felt like a testament to how far he had come. And yet, he knew this was just the beginning. Life had a way of throwing unexpected hurdles his way, but Jamal had learned to face them head-on. His classmates were different in the advanced class. They were smarter, faster, and more confident, but Jamal no longer felt like he was out of place. Instead, he felt a sense of pride in being among them. The respect from Mr. Thompson was evident. He no longer looked at Jamal with skepticism or doubt. Instead, he praised his efforts, pointed out areas where Jamal had exceeded expectations, and even began to give him leadership roles in group projects. For Jamal, this was more than just recognition, it was a validation of everything he had worked for. It wasn't just about the grades anymore, it was about being seen as someone who could make a difference, who could rise above challenges, and who had the drive to succeed. But despite all his progress, Jamal wasn't completely satisfied. He had reached a point where he wanted more, not just from himself, but from life. He realized that what he wanted wasn't just to prove people wrong. What he truly wanted was to prove to himself that he could continue to rise, to push through the toughest times, and to make something of himself that was bigger than what anyone else had imagined. As Jamal sat in class one afternoon, listening to Mr. Thompson discuss an upcoming math competition, a spark ignited within him. The idea of competing on a higher level, of showing the world his abilities beyond the classroom, filled him with excitement. It was a new challenge, one that required not just raw intelligence, but creativity, strategy, and resilience. This was the next step in his journey, and Jamal was ready. The competition was a statewide event, with students from all over competing in various categories. Jamal knew it would be intense, but he also knew it was an opportunity to test himself. Could he apply everything he had learned in the past months in a real-world scenario? Could he go from being the student in the back of the room to being the one who led the charge? For weeks, Jamal poured himself into preparation for the competition. He practiced solving complex problems in record time, refined his strategies for handling stress, and worked on his public speaking skills, knowing that a part of the competition involved presenting solutions to problems in front of an audience. Aaliyah was there every step of the way, cheering him on and offering advice. She had always been his biggest supporter, but this time, her belief in him was more than just comforting, it was a reminder of how far they had both come. They had grown up in a world that tried to keep them down, but together, they had pushed through every obstacle that life had thrown their way. The day of the competition arrived, and Jamal could hardly contain his excitement. His heart raced as he walked into the large auditorium, the air buzzing with the voices of students, teachers, and parents. There were hundreds of students from all over the state, each one a potential rival, each one a reminder of how much further he still had to go. But this time, Jamal didn't feel intimidated. He felt empowered. The competition itself was a blur of questions, puzzles, and timed challenges. Jamal was quick on his feet, solving problems faster than he ever thought possible. But it wasn't just about speed, it was about staying focused, keeping his cool under pressure, and knowing when to take risks. The pressure was immense, but Jamal thrived in it. He had been through too much already to let fear hold him back now. Finally, after hours of intense competition, the moment came. The judges were calling out the top winners, and Jamal's heart was in his throat. He had done his best, but there were so many talented students. What if it wasn't enough? Third place, the announcer said, and Jamal's heart dropped. But then, first place, the announcer paused dramatically. Jamal Carter. The words felt like a dream. Jamal could barely process what was happening as the crowd erupted in applause. He stood there, stunned, before walking to the stage to accept his trophy. As he held the golden plaque in his hands, Jamal realized that this victory wasn't just about the recognition or the prize. It was about everything he had overcome to get here. Mr. Thompson was in the audience, his face breaking into a proud smile as he clapped. For the first time, Jamal saw in his teacher's eyes not just approval, but admiration. It was the kind of look that told Jamal he had earned his place, not just in the classroom, but in the world. As he walked off the stage, the weight of the journey hit him. He had proven to everyone, including himself, that he was capable of greatness. It wasn't about how others saw him. It was about what he believed about himself. When Jamal got home that night, Aaliyah was waiting for him. "I knew you could do it," she said, wrapping her arms around him in a hug. "You were always meant for something bigger." Jamal smiled, feeling a surge of gratitude. "I couldn't have done it without you. You've always had my back." They sat together for hours, talking about the competition, about their dreams for the future. Jamal had big plans now. He wasn't just going to settle for being good enough. He was going to push forward, always striving for more. But he knew that with every step, with every victory, he was honoring everything he had fought for. For the first time in his life, Jamal didn't just feel like he was surviving. He felt like he was thriving. He had proven that no matter where you come from, no matter how many people doubt you, you can rise above it all. And with that thought in mind, Jamal knew the journey wasn't over. It was just beginning. As the weeks passed, Jamal's life seemed to fall into a new routine. He was excelling in his advanced classes, his confidence growing with each passing day. The victory at the statewide competition had become a pivotal moment in his life, a symbol of everything he had fought for. But even as things seemed to be falling into place, the old doubts that had haunted him for so long began to creep back in. Despite the external success, Jamal couldn't help but feel like there was always someone watching, waiting for him to fail. That nagging fear of not being good enough, of never truly belonging, reared its ugly head from time to time. And it wasn't just a feeling that stayed inside his mind, it started to surface in his interactions with others, especially with his classmates. Some of the kids in the advanced class had started to act differently around him. At first, it was subtle, a glance here, a chuckle there, but soon enough, it became more obvious. Jamal could feel the judgment in the air, and it made him uncomfortable. The other students, who had once seemed so welcoming, now seemed to look at him with a new kind of skepticism, as though his place in the class was somehow undeserved. One afternoon, as Jamal sat in the cafeteria with his friends, he overheard a conversation from a nearby table. He didn't mean to eavesdrop, but the words cut through the air like daggers. "Do you think Jamal really belongs in the advanced class?" one voice said, dripping with disdain. "I mean, yeah, he's smart, but he's different, you know." Jamal's stomach twisted. The conversation continued, but he couldn't bring himself to listen any longer. He stood up abruptly, grabbing his lunch tray and walking out of the cafeteria. The words echoed in his head, swirling around him. Different, it was a word he had heard too many times in his life. A word that made him feel like an outsider, like he was never truly accepted. As he walked through the hallways, Jamal tried to push the feelings away, but they clung to him like a shadow. He had worked so hard to get to where he was, to prove to the world that he was capable of more than what they thought. But now, it seemed like even his success wasn't enough to win everyone over. And that hurt. The doubt weighed heavily on his shoulders as he sat in his next class. Mr. Thompson was discussing an upcoming project, but Jamal couldn't focus. His thoughts kept drifting back to the cafeteria conversation, to the looks from his classmates. He wanted to tell himself it didn't matter, that he shouldn't let their opinions affect him, but it did matter. It always had. Mr. Thompson noticed Jamal's distracted demeanor and walked over to his desk after class. "Jamal," Mr. Thompson said, his tone gentle but concerned. Is everything okay? You seem a bit off today. Jamal forced a smile, not wanting to seem weak. I'm fine, Mr. Thompson. Just a little tired, I guess. But Mr. Thompson didn't buy it. You know, I've seen a lot of students go through what you're dealing with. It's hard, feeling like you don't belong. But I can tell you this, you earned your place here. You've worked harder than anyone I know, and I'm proud of you. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Jamal nodded, appreciating the words, but they didn't completely ease the storm brewing in his mind. Thanks, Mr. Thompson, he said quietly, his voice betraying his unease. After school, Jamal went home and found Aaliyah in the kitchen, her back to him as she prepared dinner. She could always tell when something was wrong. As soon as she turned around and saw his face, she raised an eyebrow. What happened? I overheard something today, Jamal said, his voice tight. Some of the kids in my class, they don't think I belong there. They think I'm different. Aaliyah put down the knife she was holding and walked over to him. Jamal, you know that's just jealousy, right? People always try to bring others down when they see them doing well. They don't want to admit that you worked hard for it. I know, Jamal muttered, rubbing his eyes. But it still hurts. It feels like I'm always going to be the outsider. No matter how hard I try, no matter how much I achieve, it's never enough for them. Aaliyah looked at him for a long moment before speaking. Jamal, you've proven over and over again that you're capable of greatness. These people don't know your story. They don't know how hard you fought. So don't let them define you. You're the one who gets to decide who you are and what you can do. Jamal smiled faintly, appreciating her unwavering support. Thanks, Aaliyah. I guess I just need to hear that sometimes. She gave him a playful nudge. Of course. But you need to remember one thing, success isn't about getting everyone's approval. It's about doing your best and being proud of who you are. Later that night, as Jamal lay in bed, he reflected on Aaliyah's words. It wasn't about proving himself to others anymore. He had already done that. It was about finding peace within himself, knowing that no matter what anyone else thought, he was enough. He had earned his place, and he wasn't going to let anyone take that from him. The next day, Jamal walked into school with his head held high. He could still feel the judgment from his classmates, but it no longer bothered him. He had worked too hard, fought too long, and come too far to let their opinions hold him back. In Mr. Thompson's class, as they started the lesson, Jamal felt something shift within him. For the first time, he wasn't focused on what others thought of him. He was focused on his own growth, his own future. He was determined to keep pushing forward, no matter what. He had learned that his journey wasn't just about success, it was about resilience, about rising above the doubts, the fears, and the obstacles that life threw his way. And with each step, Jamal grew stronger. The days following the awkward cafeteria incident weren't easy for Jamal. While his self-assurance had been momentarily shaken, he quickly realized that the only way to prove his worth was by continuing to rise above the adversity. Despite this resolve, there was something in the air at school that felt off. Jamal's growing sense of confidence, while invigorating, didn't erase the subtle undercurrent of judgment he continued to face from certain classmates. He spent hours reviewing assignments, organizing study sessions with friends like Aaliyah, and studying more intensely than ever before. He had learned to embrace hard work as his shield, something he could use to defend against the negativity and doubt that sometimes seemed to threaten his sense of belonging. But, as much as he focused on his studies, Jamal couldn't shake the lingering feeling that something was looming, something beyond his control. It all came to a head one Thursday afternoon in Mr. Thompson's class. They had just wrapped up a lengthy discussion on physics, covering everything from Newton's laws of motion to advanced principles of thermodynamics. Jamal had been on top of the material for weeks, and it was no surprise when Mr. Thompson called on him to solve a particularly complex problem on the board. Jamal stood up, walking to the front of the room with confidence. The class fell silent. He grabbed the marker, approached the dry erase board, and began working through the steps, showing the various formulas and calculations with the precision he had come to expect of himself. Halfway through the problem, though, he faltered. His mind blanked. He hesitated for a moment, searching for the next step in his head. The seconds felt like hours. His palms grew sweaty as he scanned the board, willing the answer to come to him. But nothing. He took a deep breath and tried again, but the more he tried, the worse it became. The entire class was watching. He could feel their eyes on him. The silence felt deafening. And then, a voice interrupted the stillness. "You're making it too complicated," a voice called out from the back of the room. Jamal froze, the words stinging more than he expected. He turned to see Tyler, one of the top students in the class, leaning back in his chair with a smug grin on his face. Mr. Thompson glanced from Jamal to Tyler, then back at Jamal. The room was tense. Jamal's face flushed. He couldn't believe it, his mind had slipped in front of everyone, and now Tyler was calling him out. His entire sense of control, the confidence he had worked so hard to build, felt like it was slipping through his fingers. "I can solve it in a minute," Tyler said, raising his hand, uninvited. Jamal's hands gripped the marker tighter. He wanted to shout at Tyler, to tell him that this wasn't his moment to shine. But he couldn't bring himself to say anything. Instead, he stepped back, ceding the stage to Tyler, who quickly strode up to the board with a triumphant smirk. Tyler worked through the problem in mere seconds, effortlessly filling the board with the solution. "See? Simple," he said with a sarcastic laugh, his gaze turning toward Jamal. The class snickered, and Jamal's heart sank. Mr. Thompson cleared his throat, bringing the class back to attention. "Thank you, Tyler." But Jamal was on the right track. "We all make mistakes. It's part of learning." Jamal nodded, forcing a tight smile, but the damage was done. The rest of the class resumed, but Jamal could feel the weight of the moment. He had been humiliated in front of everyone. It wasn't just the error, it was the fact that he had let his guard down. He had let doubt sneak in again, and now everyone had witnessed it. The specter of judgment that he'd been fighting against for so long had reared its ugly head once again. As soon as the bell rang, signaling the end of the class, Jamal quickly gathered his things and headed out, not wanting to stay in the same room for another second. He could already hear the whispers behind him. "Did you see that?" Jamal couldn't even solve a basic problem. Once outside the classroom, Jamal stopped and took a deep breath. He felt like everything he had worked so hard for was crumbling. Every accomplishment, every victory, felt insignificant in the face of his failure. But then, a hand gently touched his shoulder. It was Mr. Thompson. "You okay, Jamal?" his teacher asked quietly. Jamal forced himself to meet Mr. Thompson's eyes. "I don't know. I just feel like I blew it." Mr. Thompson gave him a reassuring smile. "Listen, I get it. But don't let one moment define you. You've been doing great. One mistake doesn't change everything you've accomplished." Jamal swallowed hard, feeling the lump in his throat. "But it wasn't just a mistake, Mr. Thompson. Tyler called me out in front of everyone. It's like they're all just waiting for me to fail." Mr. Thompson's expression softened. "That's not true, Jamal. Some people can't handle seeing others succeed, especially if it challenges their sense of self-worth. But you're here because you earned your place. And I'm proud of you. That's what matters." Jamal felt a flicker of something, hope, maybe. But it wasn't enough to fully lift the weight that had settled in his chest. He nodded, forcing himself to breathe. "I just wish I could get it all together," Jamal said, looking down at his hands. "I feel like I'm always trying to prove myself, and it's exhausting." Mr. Thompson patted him on the back. "That's the thing about success, Jamal. It's not a destination, it's a journey. And the people who truly succeed are the ones who keep going, even when it gets tough. You're stronger than you think. Later that evening, Jamal sat with Aaliyah on their front porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The world was quiet, but inside him, the storm raged on. He didn't want to admit it, but he was scared. Scared that he wasn't good enough. Scared that no matter how hard he tried, he'd always be an outsider. Aaliyah turned to him, sensing the depth of his emotions. Jamal, I know it's hard. But don't let one person's opinion control how you feel about yourself. You've come so far, and one mistake doesn't erase that. Jamal sighed, his gaze drifting to the fading light. I know. But it's just so hard sometimes. It feels like I can't win no matter what. Aaliyah smiled softly. You will. You just have to keep going. You're stronger than anyone gives you credit for. Jamal let out a quiet breath, allowing her words to sink in. Maybe she was right. Maybe the journey wasn't about perfection. Maybe it was about pushing through the doubts, the failures, and the setbacks. He had come so far. And no matter what, he wasn't going to stop now. The days following Jamal's embarrassing moment in class were filled with a quiet sort of tension. While the whispers from his classmates were fewer, the weight of his failure still hung over him. He found it hard to shake the feeling that Tyler's challenge had somehow broken something in him, something he was still trying to piece back together. But as the week went on, Jamal began to realize that the incident didn't have to define him. Yes, it hurt, and yes, it made him feel small in front of everyone, but it wasn't the end. If anything, it could be the catalyst for something better. He just needed to find his footing again. One afternoon, as Jamal walked home from school, his phone buzzed with a message from Aaliyah, "Meet me at the park after school. I have something important to talk about." Aaliyah had always been his rock, and if she wanted to talk, he was more than happy to listen. He didn't know what it was, but he could tell something was weighing on her too. Maybe it would help them both if they talked it out. When he arrived at the park, Aaliyah was sitting on their usual bench, her legs crossed, looking pensive. As soon as she saw him, she smiled faintly, but there was an intensity in her eyes that Jamal had never seen before. "Hey," he greeted her, sitting down next to her. "What's going on? You seem like you've got a lot on your mind." Aaliyah took a deep breath, looking out at the basketball courts where a group of kids were playing. "I've been thinking a lot about everything. About you, about me, about how we're always pushing so hard to prove ourselves. I think I've figured something out." Jamal raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Aaliyah turned toward him, her expression serious. "I think we've been going about this all wrong. We've been fighting so hard for other people's validation. But maybe it's not about proving anything to anyone else. Maybe it's about proving it to ourselves." Jamal felt a shift in his chest. Aaliyah's words hit him like a wave. It was like she was speaking directly to the core of everything he had been feeling. He had spent so much time trying to prove his worth to people who didn't believe in him, his classmates, his teachers, even his family at times. But he had never truly asked himself what he wanted to prove. "You're right," Jamal said, his voice soft but sure. "I've been letting other people's doubts control how I see myself. I've been trying to be what they want me to be, and I think that's what's holding me back." Aaliyah smiled, her eyes brightening. "Exactly. It's time to stop focusing on their doubts, Jamal. It's time to focus on your own. What do you want for yourself? Not for anyone else. For you." For a moment, Jamal sat in silence, absorbing her words. He hadn't truly thought about it like that before. The idea of shifting his focus from external expectations to his own internal desires was liberating. It felt like a weight was lifting off his shoulders. "I've been so focused on fitting in, on making everyone else see me as enough, that I've forgotten to ask myself what I think I'm capable of," he said, his voice growing steadier with each word. "It's time to stop running this race for them and start running it for myself." Aaliyah leaned in, her voice gentle but firm. Exactly. You've always had the potential, Jamal. You just need to realize that you are the one who gets to decide your worth. Not them. You. Jamal nodded slowly, a sense of calm beginning to spread through him. Aaliyah's words were exactly what he needed to hear. For the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of clarity. It wasn't about what others expected. It wasn't about fitting into a mold or trying to prove that he belonged. It was about pushing himself to be the best version of himself, not for anyone else's approval, but for his own growth. I'm ready, he said with a quiet determination, meeting Aaliyah's gaze. I'm ready to stop doubting myself. I'm ready to be who I'm meant to be. Aaliyah smiled broadly, her eyes sparkling with pride. That's the Jamal I've always known. The conversation with Aaliyah was exactly the turning point Jamal needed. From that moment on, he began to change how he approached his life. Instead of letting the negativity of others dictate his actions, he chose to focus on his own growth. He stopped worrying about whether or not people believed in him, and started investing in what he knew he was capable of. At school, Jamal began to approach his studies with a renewed sense of purpose. He didn't need to impress anyone. He didn't need to be perfect. He just needed to keep improving for himself. And when he did make mistakes, he saw them as opportunities to learn, not as failures. It didn't take long for Jamal to see results. His grades improved, his confidence grew, and the whispers from his classmates seemed less threatening. Even Tyler, who had once seemed so smug and untouchable, began to respect Jamal in a way that he hadn't before. Jamal wasn't just the black kid in the advanced class anymore, he was a force to be reckoned with, someone who commanded attention with his talent, determination, and quiet strength. And while the external validation was nice, it no longer mattered as much as it once had. Jamal knew that the most important approval he could earn was his own. One Friday afternoon, as Jamal sat in the library after school, working on a particularly tough math problem, Mr. Thompson walked by and paused to glance at what he was doing. Looks like you're making some serious progress, Jamal, he said with a nod of approval. Jamal looked up, his eyes bright. Yeah, I'm getting the hang of it. I've just been focusing on improving, you know. For me, not for anyone else. Mr. Thompson smiled. Good. That's the key to real success. Keep it up. As Jamal walked home later that day, the weight of doubt that had plagued him for so long felt almost non-existent. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was in control of his own destiny. The world might have its doubts, but Jamal knew that he had the power to rewrite the narrative on his own terms. And with that, a sense of peace washed over him, knowing that he was on the right path. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Jamal sat in the back of Mr. Thompson's class, quietly reviewing his notes. The steady hum of chatter in the classroom slowly faded as the bell rang, signaling the start of a new period. Today, Mr. Thompson had promised to return their graded physics tests, and Jamal was eager to see the results. Over the past few weeks, he had made a conscious effort to change his mindset, focusing on his progress rather than seeking validation from others. Still, he couldn't help but feel a little nervous. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the test that would prove to himself that he could succeed. As Mr. Thompson made his way down the rows, handing out papers, Jamal's heart beat a little faster. He could feel the weight of the moment. When the teacher finally reached him, Mr. Thompson gave him a quick smile before placing his test on his desk. Jamal glanced down at the paper. His heart skipped a beat. A-. It wasn't a perfect score, but it was a solid result. And more importantly, it was a testament to how far he had come since the first day of school when he was uncertain about his place in the class. He had worked for this. He had put in the effort and, despite the doubts, the mistakes, and the setbacks, he had proven to himself that he could achieve something. The class continued as Mr. Thompson went over the test answers. Jamal felt a surge of pride as his classmates exchanged their own papers with each other, but it wasn't the praise of others that mattered now. The validation he had sought from everyone else was no longer as important. What mattered was how he felt about himself. But it wasn't long before Tyler, who had always been a step ahead in class, turned to Jamal with a raised eyebrow. "Not bad," he said, leaning back in his chair. "But I thought you could do better." Jamal raised an eyebrow, surprised by the comment. It wasn't the scorn he had expected, but it wasn't exactly praise either. Tyler's tone was a mix of begrudging respect and unspoken competition. "Could have done better if I didn't mess up that one question," Jamal said, shrugging casually. "But I'll take it. Progress is progress, right?" Tyler's eyes narrowed slightly as he studied Jamal's response. He seemed taken aback by how nonchalant Jamal was about the grade. For a moment, there was a flicker of something in Tyler's expression, something Jamal couldn't quite place. Was it respect? Was it recognition? "You've been studying a lot lately, huh?" Tyler asked, his tone a little softer now. Jamal met his gaze and nodded. "Yeah. I've been working on improving. For myself." For the first time in months, Jamal could see Tyler's walls crack. It wasn't much, but there was a shift in the way Tyler looked at him. The usual smugness was gone, replaced by something different. Maybe, just maybe, Jamal was starting to get through to him. The rest of the day passed by in a blur. Jamal could feel the shift in how people treated him. There was less judgment, less scrutiny. The whispers that had once followed him around now seemed quieter, more distant. His classmates, for the most part, seemed to be taking him more seriously. They saw him as someone who belonged in the advanced class, not just as an anomaly or a curiosity, but as a legitimate student who had earned his place. That afternoon, Jamal sat with Aaliyah at their usual spot in the library, working through some chemistry problems. He felt an unfamiliar sense of peace, a quiet satisfaction that came from knowing he was moving forward. The struggle was far from over, but he could finally see that the hard work was paying off. Aaliyah glanced over at him, a sly smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. "I noticed Tyler talking to you after class. You two seemed different. Was he being nice to you?" Jamal chuckled, shaking his head. "I wouldn't go that far. But he definitely wasn't being a jerk for once. We actually talked, and it wasn't all about competing or trying to one-up each other." Aaliyah raised an eyebrow, clearly impressed. "Wow. That's progress. Maybe you've finally cracked the Tyler code." Jamal laughed, but inside, he couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment. It wasn't about Tyler or anyone else, it was about the fact that he had gotten to this point on his own. He had worked hard to improve, to prove to himself that he had what it took to succeed. And now, for the first time, it seemed like others were starting to see it too. "I think we're both starting to figure things out," Jamal said, his voice more confident than it had been in weeks. Aaliyah nodded. "We are. You've come so far, Jamal. And don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Jamal smiled. He knew she was right. He had come far. And now that he had his own validation, the rest of the world's opinions didn't matter as much. That evening, as Jamal walked home, he felt a sense of quiet pride in his chest. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The following week, a new challenge emerged. The school was organizing a regional science competition, and Jamal's physics class was invited to participate. Mr. Thompson approached him one afternoon after class with an opportunity. "Jamal," Mr. Thompson began, "I know you've been putting in a lot of work lately. How would you feel about representing the class in the competition?" Jamal's heart skipped. The competition was fierce, and while he had been doing well in class, the thought of competing against the best students from other schools made him nervous. "I'm honored," Mr. Thompson," Jamal said, his voice steady. "But I'm not sure I'm ready for something like that." Mr. Thompson smiled. "I think you're more than ready. You've already proven you can rise to the occasion. You have what it takes." Jamal hesitated for a moment, his mind racing. He could feel the weight of the challenge, but this was his moment. This was the chance to take everything he had worked for and put it to the test. After a long pause, Jamal finally nodded. "Okay. I'll do it. I'll give it everything I've got." Mr. Thompson's eyes lit up with approval. "That's the spirit. I know you'll do great." As Jamal left school that day, a new sense of determination filled him. This wasn't just another test or assignment. This was his chance to prove to everyone, not just the world, but to himself, that he was more than capable. This was his time to show that he wasn't just a student in an advanced class, he was a force to be reckoned with. And this time, there would be no holding back. The day of the regional science competition arrived faster than Jamal had anticipated. Weeks of preparation, late nights, and countless hours spent poring over textbooks and research materials had led to this pivotal moment. It was hard to believe that he had gone from being the kid who barely fit into representing his class in a regional competition. He had to admit, a part of him was still nervous. The competition was intense, and the best students from different schools would be present. He had seen how talented they were during practice sessions, and he couldn't help but wonder if he truly belonged among them. But as he walked to the competition venue that morning, something had changed. He didn't feel like the same Jamal who had walked into Mr. Thompson's class months ago, uncertain of himself. No, this Jamal was different. This Jamal was someone who had faced doubts and fears, someone who had learned to push past them and keep moving forward. As he arrived at the venue, he took a deep breath. The large auditorium was filled with teams of students, all gathered around tables, setting up their projects and preparing for the event. The air buzzed with energy, a mixture of excitement and anxiety. Jamal found Mr. Thompson and Aaliyah, who was also participating in the competition, and made his way to their designated table. It wasn't a surprise that Aaliyah had been chosen as one of the top students to represent their school. She was brilliant, but Jamal had come to realize that he, too, had more to offer than he had ever thought possible. "You ready for this?" Aaliyah asked, her eyes gleaming with excitement as she set up their project on the table. "As ready as I'll ever be," Jamal replied, feeling a surge of adrenaline. He glanced at the other teams around them, trying to gauge how they were doing, but quickly reminded himself that it didn't matter. It was about his effort, his work, and how much he had grown. He wasn't in this competition to impress anyone. He was here to prove to himself that he was capable. Mr. Thompson stood behind them, offering quiet encouragement. "Remember, Jamal, it's not about being the best. It's about doing your best. Stay calm, stay focused, and take pride in what you've done. You've come so far." Jamal nodded, appreciating his teacher's words. He knew that Mr. Thompson believed in him, and that belief gave him a sense of confidence. He was ready to give everything he had in that moment. The competition began with each team presenting their projects. Jamal and Aaliyah's project was based on renewable energy, a topic that had fascinated Jamal since he'd started researching it for the competition. They had worked together to create a model that demonstrated how solar energy could be used more efficiently in urban areas. Jamal was proud of what they had accomplished. It was his first time working on a project this detailed, and the research had required an immense amount of effort. When it was their turn to present, Jamal stood in front of the judges, his heart racing, but his voice steady. Aaliyah began by explaining the background of their project, and Jamal followed with the scientific principles behind it, detailing their design and how it could be implemented in real-world applications. Despite the nervousness, he found his rhythm, speaking clearly and confidently about the work they had done. As he spoke, Jamal remembered what Aaliyah had said to him weeks ago: this was for him. Not for the judges, not for anyone else. This was about showing himself what he was capable of. The judges listened intently, nodding as they asked questions. At one point, one of the judges raised an eyebrow and asked a tough question about the energy efficiency of their design. For a brief moment, Jamal froze. But then he remembered something. He had spent countless hours studying this, and he knew the answer. With a calmness he hadn't expected, Jamal answered the question, explaining their calculations and providing further evidence to back up their claims. Aaliyah shot him an encouraging look, and Jamal felt a surge of confidence. He had nailed it. When their presentation ended, the judges thanked them and moved on to the next team. Jamal couldn't help but feel proud of the way he handled the situation. For the first time, he truly felt like he belonged. The competition went on for hours, but Jamal didn't pay much attention to the other teams. He wasn't comparing himself to them anymore. He had already proven what he needed to prove, not to them, but to himself. Finally, after a long wait, the judges began to announce the winners. Jamal stood with Aaliyah, their fingers crossed as they anxiously awaited the results. It didn't matter if they won or lost, it was the journey that counted, the growth they had experienced. But still, he couldn't deny the excitement buzzing in his chest. And the third-place winner is Green Innovations team from Oakwood High. Jamal couldn't help but smile. He hadn't expected to place, but there they were, being called up. He and Aaliyah exchanged a look of surprise before walking to the stage to accept their award. As they stood there, holding their trophy, Jamal realized that this moment wasn't about the trophy at all. It was about the effort, the hard work, and the growth that had led him here. As they made their way back to their seats, Mr. Thompson gave him a knowing smile. "You did it," he said. "You proved to yourself what you're capable of." Jamal smiled back, his chest swelling with pride. "I guess I did." The rest of the day passed by in a blur. The competition had been a success, and Jamal had learned a lot. But it was more than just winning or losing, it was about how he had transformed. He had stopped doubting himself, stopped trying to prove his worth to others, and in doing so, had earned his place among the best. As Jamal walked home later that evening, he couldn't stop smiling. The road ahead would still have its challenges, but he was ready for whatever came next. He had faced his doubts, overcome his fears, and now, nothing could hold him back. The weeks following the competition were a whirlwind. Jamal felt a new sense of pride every time he walked into school. The trophy from the science competition sat on the corner of his desk, a constant reminder of how far he had come. He had earned respect from his peers, and the confidence he had built through his hard work was starting to feel like a permanent part of who he was. But even as Jamal moved forward, there was something nagging at the back of his mind. The validation he had gained from his victory felt like a fleeting moment. As much as he had changed, he couldn't shake the feeling that he still had to prove something to others, especially to Mr. Thompson. It wasn't that his teacher had been anything less than supportive, quite the opposite. But Jamal couldn't escape the nagging feeling that there was still a gap between the person he had been and the person he was becoming. His internal doubts, which had once defined him, were now being replaced by a different kind of pressure, the pressure to maintain his success, to keep improving, and to show everyone that he wasn't just a one-hit wonder. The shift in how others saw him was still evident, but there were still whispers in the hallways. There were still some students who questioned whether his success had been a fluke or if he really belonged among the top achievers in the class. And for some reason, Jamal couldn't stop thinking about them. It was as if he needed their approval, even when he knew deep down that he didn't. One afternoon, as Jamal walked into Mr. Thompson's classroom, he noticed a few of his classmates huddled around a table, talking in low voices. He tried to ignore them and went to his seat, but the atmosphere in the room felt different, tense, almost. When the bell rang, signaling the start of class, Mr. Thompson stood up in front of the room, his usual warm demeanor now replaced with something more serious. "Class," he began, "I need to talk to you all about something important." Jamal sat up straighter, his stomach tightening as he watched Mr. Thompson. This wasn't the usual opening to class. Something was different. Mr. Thompson continued, his voice steady but firm. There has been some discussion going on around here lately about fairness in grading and whether some of you are receiving the recognition you truly deserve. Jamal's heart skipped a beat. He couldn't help but wonder if the conversation was about him, about the recent science competition, and whether others felt like he didn't deserve his place among the top students. I want to make it clear to all of you, Mr. Thompson said, his gaze sweeping across the room, that grades and recognition aren't about popularity or perceptions. They're about the work you put in, the effort you show, and the progress you make. Jamal, for example, Mr. Thompson paused, his eyes locking onto Jamal's, has worked harder than anyone in this class, and that effort is reflected in his achievements. Jamal's face flushed. He felt exposed, his insecurities amplified by the attention. He didn't want the spotlight, he didn't want to feel like a target. I know there are students who may be feeling discouraged right now, Mr. Thompson continued, his voice softening, but I want to remind you that everyone has the potential to grow. Success isn't a competition against others, it's about competing with yourself. Jamal felt a wave of relief wash over him. Mr. Thompson wasn't just defending him, he was speaking to everyone, reminding them that growth was a personal journey. But even as Mr. Thompson spoke, Jamal couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more he had to prove, both to others and to himself. The rest of the class passed in a blur, but Jamal couldn't focus on anything. The weight of Mr. Thompson's words still lingered in his mind. Was he truly content with where he was, or was he simply trying to meet everyone else's expectations? After class, as Jamal gathered his things, he was startled when Tyler walked over to him. Jamal hadn't expected the encounter. Tyler had never really talked to him much before, especially not since the competition. "Hey," Tyler said, his tone unusually neutral. "You did good in that competition. I guess I misjudged you." Jamal nodded, unsure of how to respond. Was this an apology? Or just a comment? Tyler gave him a half-smile. "You've earned your place in this class. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. You're not a fluke." Jamal couldn't help but feel a small smile tug at his lips. Maybe Tyler was finally starting to see him for who he really was, not just as a student who got lucky, but as someone who had worked hard to earn his achievements. "Thanks," Jamal said simply. "I appreciate that." Tyler shrugged, his eyes glinting with something unreadable. "No problem. Just don't let your head get too big, all right? We still need to see what you can do next." Jamal chuckled, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. "Don't worry, I'm not done yet." As Tyler walked away, Jamal was left standing there, his thoughts racing. This conversation, brief as it was, had made him realize something important. He had spent so much time seeking validation from others, trying to prove that he wasn't a fluke, that he hadn't fully embraced his own potential. Now, for the first time, he could see that his success wasn't about winning approval, it was about the work he had done and the person he was becoming. Jamal knew that there would always be moments of doubt. There would always be people who questioned him, who doubted his abilities. But he had learned something crucial, he didn't need to prove himself to anyone else. His worth wasn't determined by their opinions. As he walked home that afternoon, the uncertainty he had carried with him for so long began to fade. The road ahead would still be difficult, and he would still face challenges. But for the first time, Jamal felt ready to face them, not for the approval of others, but for his own growth. The next day, in class, he raised his hand to answer a question without hesitation. His voice was strong, his confidence unwavering. He wasn't just answering the question, he was proving to himself that he was ready to keep pushing forward, no matter what. And as the days passed, Jamal realized that it was this confidence, the one he had built on his own, that would carry him through the challenges ahead. The weeks following his breakthrough were some of the most challenging Jamal had ever faced. As much as he had gained confidence in his abilities, there was a constant pressure to live up to the expectations that had been placed on him. He wasn't just the quiet kid anymore, now, he was the kid who had won a regional science competition, the kid who had defied the odds, the one who was expected to keep achieving. At first, he thought he could handle it. But soon enough, the weight of it all started to feel like a heavy backpack he couldn't take off. One afternoon, as Jamal sat at lunch with Aaliyah, his mind was somewhere else. He barely registered the conversation as she talked about a new assignment they had in their AP chemistry class. His mind kept racing with thoughts of the upcoming exams and projects, all piling up and demanding his attention. He had always been a good student, but now, he was expected to be the best. Every test, every project, every assignment seemed to carry the burden of his previous successes. Jamal. Aaliyah's voice broke through his thoughts. Are you okay? You've been really quiet today. Jamal blinked, looking up at her. Yeah, I'm just. I don't know. I feel like there's so much pressure right now. It's like I can't make a mistake without everyone noticing. Aaliyah frowned, pushing her hair behind her ear. You know, Jamal, you're doing great. You've come a long way. But you can't expect yourself to be perfect all the time. You don't have to carry the weight of everyone else's expectations on your shoulders. He sighed, resting his elbows on the table. I know. I know I've come a long way, but it's hard not to feel like I have to keep proving myself. What if I mess up? What if I can't keep up with all the new challenges? Aaliyah leaned forward, her expression serious. Listen, Jamal, I've seen what you can do. You've already proven yourself more than enough. But that's the thing, what you do now doesn't define who you are. You don't have to keep proving yourself. Just focus on doing your best, and that's enough. You don't owe anyone anything, not even your best every single day. Jamal appreciated Aaliyah's words, but a part of him still felt restless. The pressure wasn't just coming from his classmates or even the school. It was coming from within him. He had set the bar high, and the thought of falling short terrified him. The next week, the pressure only intensified. Jamal found himself staying up later and later to keep up with his assignments and study for tests. His once clear focus began to blur. There was too much on his plate, and he couldn't juggle it all. Every test felt like a performance, every homework assignment like a trial. One day, he found himself sitting at his desk, staring at his notes for a history exam, unable to concentrate. His mind kept drifting back to the competition, to the success he had achieved, and to the unspoken expectation that he would keep succeeding. The weight of that expectation was suffocating. His phone buzzed, breaking his trance. It was a message from Mr. Thompson. Jamal, I'd like to see you after school today. I have something I want to discuss. Jamal frowned. What could that be about? He had done well in the science competition, and his grades were solid. But something in Mr. Thompson's message felt different, and Jamal couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than just a casual check-in. Later that day, Jamal walked into Mr. Thompson's classroom after school, his stomach tied in knots. The teacher was sitting behind his desk, a thoughtful expression on his face. Jamal, Mr. Thompson said as he looked up, I've been noticing something lately. You've been working harder than anyone, but I also see a change in you. You're putting more pressure on yourself than you should. Jamal looked down, guilt creeping in. He had been trying so hard to keep up with everything, but he hadn't realized how much it was starting to affect him. I'm fine, Mr. Thompson, Jamal replied quickly, though the words didn't feel true. I've just got a lot on my plate right now. I can handle it. Mr. Thompson studied him for a moment before speaking again. I know you can handle it, Jamal. But the thing is, I don't want you to burn out. You're pushing yourself so hard, and I can see it. You're becoming someone who is doing everything to meet expectations, but you're not taking the time to just be yourself. Jamal shifted uncomfortably. He hadn't expected the conversation to take this turn. What do you mean by that? Mr. Thompson leaned forward, his voice steady but kind. What I mean is that you're letting your achievements define you. You're measuring yourself by how well you do instead of who you are. That's dangerous. You're more than your grades and your trophies, Jamal. You need to take a step back and breathe. It's okay to not have it all figured out. You don't need to prove anything to anyone, especially not yourself. Jamal felt a lump form in his throat. Mr. Thompson's words were a lifeline, but they also made him realize how deeply he had been struggling without even realizing it. The pressure he had been feeling wasn't just external, it was coming from within him, from his own fears and insecurities. He had been so focused on doing everything perfectly that he had forgotten to appreciate how far he had come. I guess I didn't realize how much I was letting the pressure affect me, Jamal admitted quietly, his voice betraying his exhaustion. I've just been so scared of disappointing everyone, especially myself. Mr. Thompson smiled gently, his eyes understanding. I get it. But you need to remember that growth isn't linear. There will be days when you're on top of the world, and there will be days when you struggle. And that's okay. What matters is that you keep moving forward, one step at a time. Don't let the fear of failure stop you from embracing the journey. Jamal nodded, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. For the first time in a while, he felt like he could let go of the weight he had been carrying. He didn't have to have everything figured out. He just needed to focus on his growth, his progress, and take things one day at a time. Thanks, Mr. Thompson, Jamal said, his voice steadier now. I think I needed to hear that. Mr. Thompson stood up and clapped him on the back. Anytime, Jamal. And remember, it's okay to ask for help when you need it. As Jamal walked out of the classroom that afternoon, he felt lighter. The weight of his expectations still lingered, but now, he had the tools to manage them. He had a long way to go, but for the first time in a while, he felt ready to face whatever came next, without the fear of failure holding him back. Jamal's perspective on the future began to shift. He still had a long way to go academically, but after his conversation with Mr. Thompson, he finally felt like he could breathe again. The expectations, both internal and external, had weighed him down for so long, but now he was starting to see that there was more to his life than just achievements and grades. The journey itself, the growth, the struggle, the learning, was what truly mattered. The next few days were a mix of self-reflection and small victories. Jamal made a conscious decision to approach each day with less pressure, to allow himself moments of relaxation, and to be okay with imperfection. For the first time, he let himself enjoy the process of learning rather than fixating on the end results. However, life had a funny way of challenging even the most well-intentioned changes. As the semester drew to a close, Jamal found himself facing a massive project for his history class. The assignment seemed like an insurmountable task, researching a historical figure and presenting a detailed report on their impact. It was a project that would account for a significant portion of his final grade, and his classmates were already starting to freak out. I don't know about you, but I'm pretty sure I'm going to bomb this project, Tyler said as they sat together in the cafeteria during lunch. This thing is huge. I feel like I'm drowning in research already. Jamal smiled sympathetically. He understood the pressure. The project had been assigned a week ago, and the deadline was fast approaching. Tyler was right, it was huge, and it required extensive research. But instead of feeling overwhelmed, Jamal felt strangely calm. He remembered what Mr. Thompson had told him about embracing the journey. You know, Tyler, Jamal said, stirring his fries on his plate, we don't have to have it all figured out right now. We'll get through it. It's just about taking it step by step. Tyler looked at him, raising an eyebrow. Easy for you to say. You've been on a roll lately. You've got this whole science genius thing going on, so you probably have all the answers. Jamal chuckled. I wouldn't say that. But I've realized it's not about trying to be perfect all the time. It's about doing the best I can and letting go of the rest. We just have to start, right? That's the first step. Tyler seemed to take this in, chewing thoughtfully for a moment. Yeah, I guess you're right. We can't do everything at once. They spent the rest of lunch brainstorming their project topics, and by the end of the conversation, Jamal felt a sense of accomplishment. It wasn't the usual mad rush to get everything done in one sitting. Instead, they took the time to break things down into manageable pieces, starting with choosing a historical figure. Jamal chose Benjamin Franklin, drawn to his contributions to both science and politics, while Tyler chose Thomas Edison, inspired by his inventions and work ethic. That evening, Jamal sat down at his desk to begin his research. He didn't feel the usual pressure hanging over him, the gnawing fear that he had to excel and do everything perfectly. He had a plan, and he was going to follow it. As he scrolled through articles and books, he found himself intrigued by Franklin's inventions and his role in American history. The information flowed more easily than he expected, and before he knew it, he had completed the first section of his report. The following days went by quickly as Jamal and Tyler worked on their respective projects. They kept each other motivated and shared their progress, offering support and feedback. The process didn't feel like a race to the finish line, instead, it felt like a journey that was more enjoyable than he had anticipated. As the project deadline approached, Jamal realized something important. The fear of failure that had haunted him for so long wasn't as powerful as it used to be. He wasn't doing this for anyone's approval. He was doing it because it was his own journey, and the outcome, while important, wasn't the only measure of his worth. On the day of the presentation, Jamal stood before his class, his palms slightly sweaty but his mind focused. He was prepared. He knew his material, and he wasn't worried about being perfect. This wasn't about impressing anyone, it was about sharing what he had learned. When it was his turn to present, Jamal spoke confidently, detailing Benjamin Franklin's contributions to science, politics, and American society. He included anecdotes about Franklin's experiments with electricity, his role in drafting the Declaration of Independence, and his innovative inventions. He even shared how Franklin's curiosity and determination mirrored his own journey of self-discovery and growth. As Jamal wrapped up his presentation, he looked around the room, meeting the eyes of his classmates. He wasn't looking for approval, he was simply sharing a piece of himself with them. And as he finished, there was a moment of silence before the class broke into applause. His heart swelled with pride, but it wasn't because of the applause. It was because he had finally learned to embrace the journey, to let go of the need for perfection, and to trust in his own abilities. Later that day, when he sat down to receive his grade, Jamal was surprised to see a note from Mr. Thompson. "Great work, Jamal. You've not only demonstrated your knowledge, but you've also shown growth as a student and as a person. Keep up the good work." Jamal smiled to himself. The grade was great, but the real victory was in the process, the way he had approached the assignment, the way he had let go of his fears, and the way he had found joy in the learning itself. That was a lesson that would stay with him far beyond high school. As he walked home that afternoon, Jamal felt a sense of clarity he hadn't felt in a long time. He was still on a journey of growth, but now, he understood that it wasn't about reaching a final destination. It was about the small, incremental steps that led him forward. And for the first time, Jamal felt truly ready for whatever came next. Despite the progress Jamal had made, he knew that his journey wasn't over. Life had a way of throwing curveballs when you least expected it, and for Jamal, those curveballs came in the form of both personal and academic challenges. The final stretch of the semester was approaching, and with it, a new set of obstacles. Although he had been more balanced and had found a new sense of calm, there were still moments when the weight of expectations, both his own and others, crept back into his life. The pressures of maintaining the image of being the smart kid were never far from his mind, especially as he moved closer to finals week. One morning, Jamal was sitting in his car, parked in front of the school. The cool breeze outside made him feel somewhat at ease, but as soon as he stepped out of the car, he could feel the familiar sense of tension rising in his chest. Walking through the school's halls, he noticed the whispers again, the same ones he had grown accustomed to in the past few weeks. Jamal had once been just another face in the crowd, but now, he was the kid everyone whispered about. Did you hear? Jamal's the one who won the science competition. He's a genius. I wonder how he does it. How does someone that smart even study? Do you think he ever gets stressed out? It wasn't the compliments or the praise that bothered Jamal. It was the idea that people had started to see him as something more than human. He was no longer just Jamal, the kid who liked science, the kid who loved reading about inventions. He was Jamal, the genius, the one with the perfect grades and the perfect answers. But who was he really? Jamal wasn't sure anymore. The expectations others had for him often clouded his ability to see himself clearly. He started questioning if he had even been the one making his decisions lately, or if his actions were just reactions to the label others had placed on him. It felt like he was slipping away from himself, like the weight of everyone's expectations was consuming him. That afternoon, he found himself alone in the library during lunch, staring at his history project notes. He had already completed the work, but he couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't good enough. The pressure was building again. It was as if he had to do more, achieve more, become something even greater. But deep down, Jamal knew that wasn't sustainable. Aaliyah walked in, sensing that something was off. She sat down next to him, pulling out a snack from her bag. "You've been awfully quiet today," she said, looking at him with concern. Jamal ran a hand through his hair. "I don't know, Aaliyah. It's like I'm not allowed to be normal anymore. Everyone expects me to be this perfect student, this perfect everything, and I'm just tired. I feel like I'm losing myself, and I don't know how to stop it." Aaliyah sighed, understanding the struggle all too well. She had seen the pressure Jamal had been under since he won that science competition, and while she admired his intelligence and determination, she also knew that he was pushing himself too hard. "You don't have to do it all, Jamal," she said softly. "No one is expecting you to be perfect. You've already proven what you're capable of. But this isn't just about grades or awards. You've got to do this for you. What do you want out of this?" Jamal stared down at the desk, unsure of what to say. What did he want? All he had ever wanted was to feel seen and valued, but now that he had achieved those things, it felt like they had come with a price. "I don't know anymore. I think I got so focused on being the best that I lost sight of what really matters." Aaliyah looked him square in the eye, her expression full of empathy. "It's okay to take a step back, Jamal. You don't need to keep up this impossible standard. You're allowed to just be you. You're allowed to breathe." Jamal's heart softened. For the first time in a while, he felt the weight lifting. Maybe he didn't have to live up to the expectations of others. Maybe he could be just Jamal again, the curious, driven, imperfect person he had always been. He smiled at Aaliyah, grateful for her unwavering support. "Thanks, Aaliyah. You always know what to say." She smiled back. "That's what friends are for." The rest of the week passed more smoothly for Jamal. He still had his moments of self-doubt, but he tried to focus on the things that brought him joy, the small wins, the simple pleasures. He went back to enjoying his chemistry experiments with a sense of wonder, instead of as another task to be completed. He spent more time with Aaliyah, talking about things other than school, and for the first time in weeks, he felt like he could breathe again. Then came the weekend before finals, and with it, the final test of Jamal's resolve. He was sitting in his room, preparing for his last exam in calculus, when his phone buzzed with a text from his mom. It was a simple message, but one that hit him harder than he expected. "I'm so proud of you, Jamal. You're doing amazing, and I know you're going to keep doing great things. Just remember, be yourself, always." Jamal stared at the screen for a moment, the words sinking in. For so long, he had been so focused on what others expected of him, trying to meet their standards, that he had lost sight of what really mattered. His mom's message was a reminder of the one thing that had always been true: he was enough, just as he was. He leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. For the first time in a long time, he felt at peace. He didn't need to be perfect. He didn't need to be anyone other than himself. And no matter what happened with his exams or the next challenge he faced, he knew one thing for sure: he would face it as the person he had always been meant to be. The days leading up to finals week felt different for Jamal. The pressure was still there, lingering like a shadow in the back of his mind, but it no longer consumed him the way it once did. He had made peace with the fact that his journey was about more than just grades and external validation. It was about growth, about learning from every experience, both good and bad. But even with that newfound clarity, he couldn't deny the nerves that simmered beneath the surface. Sitting at his desk the night before his first exam, Jamal reviewed his notes for what felt like the 100th time. His chemistry textbook was open in front of him, and his notebook filled with calculations and formulas lay scattered around. The formulas made sense in theory, but Jamal's mind kept wandering to other things, like the weight of his final grade, the possibility of disappointing Mr. Thompson, and whether he would be able to maintain his genius reputation. Despite his attempts to quiet the worries, they crept in again. The voices of doubt, the ones he had been battling for so long, resurfaced. What if I fail? What if I let everyone down? It felt like the familiar tightness in his chest was returning, but this time, Jamal was ready for it. Not this time, he muttered to himself, pushing the negative thoughts away. He set his pen down and took a deep breath, remembering the advice Aaliyah had given him. He didn't need to be perfect. He didn't need to keep up with any expectations other than his own. Jamal closed his eyes for a moment, letting the weight of the day's stress slide off of his shoulders. He focused on his breathing, slowing it down until his body started to relax. In the stillness of his room, Jamal realized that he wasn't alone in this battle. He had his family, his friends, and his teachers, all rooting for him. And most importantly, he had himself. He opened his eyes and looked back at his notes. He still had work to do, but he was no longer consumed by the fear of failure. Instead, he felt a renewed sense of confidence. He knew that no matter what the outcome was, he had given it his all. And that was enough. The next day, Jamal entered the classroom with his head held high. His backpack was heavier than usual with all the study materials, but he felt lighter. He had done the work. Now, it was time to let go of the stress and give it his best shot. He sat down in his seat and greeted Mr. Thompson, who offered him a reassuring smile. "You're going to do great, Jamal. I can see how hard you've worked. Just stay calm and do your best," Mr. Thompson said. Jamal nodded, grateful for the encouragement. It was the little moments like these that helped remind him why he was doing this. He wasn't just studying for the grades, he was studying for the person he wanted to become. The exam started, and Jamal dove into the questions. They were challenging, but he remained calm. He paced himself, taking each problem one at a time. His mind was focused, but there was no longer any sense of urgency. For the first time in a long while, he was enjoying the process. He wasn't just racing to finish the exam, he was savoring the opportunity to showcase his knowledge. When the bell rang, signaling the end of the exam, Jamal felt a sense of relief wash over him. He had done everything he could. He stood up, handed in his paper, and walked out of the classroom, his head held a little higher than before. As the days passed and finals came and went, Jamal continued to embrace the lessons he had learned. He focused on doing his best, but he no longer obsessed over the results. He started to see his education as a tool for growth rather than a measuring stick for his worth. The path ahead was still uncertain, but Jamal felt ready to face whatever came next. It wasn't just about the grades anymore, it was about who he had become along the way. Finals were over. The weight that had been hanging over Jamal for weeks was finally lifted, but strangely, he didn't feel the rush of relief he'd expected. Instead, he felt a quiet sense of pride not just for having survived the exams but for how far he had come since the beginning of the year. The Jamal who had been terrified of failure, the Jamal who had sought validation in grades and awards, was now different. He had found a deeper understanding of himself. It was the Friday after finals, and Jamal found himself sitting in the school courtyard, staring at his phone. His mind was preoccupied, not with the exams he'd just finished, but with the future. What would the summer look like? What about next year, his senior year? Jamal knew that he had to continue moving forward, but he also felt the need to keep this newfound clarity alive, to hold on to the lessons he had learned. Suddenly, he felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned to see Aaliyah grinning at him, her curly hair bouncing as she took a seat next to him. "You look like you're a million miles away," she said, nudging him gently. "What's up?" Jamal smiled, grateful for her presence. "Just thinking about everything, I guess. It's weird. Finals are over, but I don't feel the way I thought I would." Aaliyah raised an eyebrow. "In what way?" "I thought I'd be relieved. But I think I'm more at peace than anything else. I've realized that it's not just about the grades or the competition or any of that. It's about finding who I really am and trusting myself. And I think I've finally started to do that." Aaliyah's smile softened. "I'm so proud of you, Jamal. You've come a long way. Honestly, I think you've learned more about life than anyone else in this school. And I'm not just talking about science." Jamal chuckled, a sense of warmth filling him. "Thanks. I think I've learned that the journey is just as important as the destination, maybe more so." Before Aaliyah could respond, Jamal's phone buzzed with a new notification. He picked it up, not expecting much, but as he glanced at the message, his heart skipped a beat. It was an email from Mr. Thompson, with the subject line, "Final grades." Oh, Jamal muttered, his nerves suddenly returning. "I guess it's that time." Aaliyah peeked over his shoulder as he opened the email. It was brief but to the point. "Dear Jamal. Congratulations on your final exam performance. Your growth throughout the year has been nothing short of inspiring. You've not only excelled academically but have shown immense personal development as well. It's clear you've gained a deeper understanding of both the subject matter and yourself. Your final grade is an A. Keep pushing forward and continue to grow, Jamal. You have a bright future ahead of you. Best. Mr. Thompson." Jamal stared at the screen for a moment, absorbing the message. It wasn't just the grade that made him feel proud, it was the acknowledgement of his growth. Mr. Thompson had seen it, and for the first time, Jamal felt that his progress as a person mattered just as much as his academic achievements. Aaliyah beamed at him. "You did it, Jamal. I knew you would." Jamal smiled, but it wasn't the same smile from before, this one was deeper, more genuine. "It feels different this time. It's not just about the grade. It's about everything I've learned, all the ways I've grown. I'm not the same person who started this year." "You're right," Aaliyah said thoughtfully. "You've evolved. And honestly, I think you're only just getting started." Jamal felt a deep sense of gratitude toward his friend. She had been by his side through all of it, the late-night study sessions, the stress, the doubts, and now, she was there to celebrate his victory, even if it wasn't just about the grade. Over the next few weeks, Jamal took time to reflect on everything that had happened. He spent time with family, caught up with friends, and enjoyed the break that had once felt so elusive. It wasn't the absence of work that brought him peace, it was the absence of the constant pressure to perform. Jamal began to understand that there would always be challenges ahead, but that didn't mean he had to face them alone or with fear. He continued to explore his passion for science, not for recognition but for the pure joy it brought him. He spent his afternoons reading about new discoveries, tinkering with small experiments in his makeshift home lab, and imagining the possibilities that lay ahead. But for the first time, his passion wasn't driven by the need to prove anything to anyone. It was about curiosity. It was about wonder. It was about doing what he loved, on his terms. One Saturday afternoon, Jamal was at a local park, enjoying the sunshine, when he ran into Mr. Thompson. It was a pleasant surprise, and they spent a few minutes chatting. Mr. Thompson had a way of making Jamal feel heard, like his thoughts and experiences mattered beyond just his academic abilities. "You know, Jamal, I've been thinking," Mr. Thompson said as they walked along the park path. "You have a lot of potential, not just as a student but as a person. You've got the mind of a scientist, but you've also got the heart of a leader. I hope you never lose sight of that." Jamal felt a sense of pride swell within him. He had always admired Mr. Thompson, but hearing those words from someone he respected so much felt like another layer of validation. It wasn't just the grade that mattered to him anymore, it was the growth. The journey had shaped him into someone who was more than his accomplishments. "Thank you, Mr. Thompson," Jamal said sincerely. "I'm really starting to understand what you mean. It's not just about grades or tests. It's about the person you become along the way." Mr. Thompson smiled warmly. "Exactly. And if you ever need someone to talk to, I'm always here." As Jamal walked away from their conversation, he felt a sense of peace he had never known before. He was no longer afraid of what the future might hold because he had learned that the future wasn't a destination, it was a continuation of the journey. And as long as he stayed true to himself, he knew he would continue to grow, no matter where life took him. The summer break was in full swing, but Jamal didn't have the usual sense of freedom most kids his age experienced. His mind wasn't fully at rest, and while the school year had ended, his thoughts were still lingering on his growth over the past year, how he had changed, what he had learned, and where he was headed next. Jamal spent a lot of time with Aaliyah, who had become more than just a friend over the past months. She had been his constant support, and they had shared so many moments of self-reflection and personal growth. She had seen him struggle with doubts and insecurities, but she had also witnessed his transformation into someone who was confident in his abilities, someone who had stopped seeking validation from others. But Jamal knew that, like every chapter in life, this phase too would eventually come to an end. Senior year loomed on the horizon, and with it came new challenges and new responsibilities. One afternoon, Jamal was sitting at the local coffee shop, reading through a science magazine, when his phone buzzed. It was a message from his mom, and he couldn't help but smile when he read it. "I'm so proud of you, Jamal. Keep being the amazing person you are. Remember, no matter what, I believe in you." The simple message was a reminder that, even though Jamal had been driven by the need to prove himself to others, he had always had the support of those who truly mattered. His mom had never pressured him to be perfect. She had always loved him for who he was, flaws and all. That was something he had begun to understand more deeply in the past year, that love, in its truest form, didn't come with expectations. Just as Jamal was about to put his phone down, a shadow fell over his table. He looked up to find Mr. Thompson standing there, smiling. Jamal had seen his teacher a few times over the summer, and their conversations had been a grounding presence during these transitional months. "Mind if I join you?" Mr. Thompson asked, pulling out the chair opposite Jamal. "Of course," Jamal replied with a grin. "What's up?" Mr. Thompson sat down, taking a sip of his coffee before looking at Jamal. "I've been thinking a lot about you lately, Jamal. The way you've handled everything this year. It's not easy to change the way you think about yourself, and I've watched you grow into someone who isn't afraid to face challenges head-on." Jamal shifted in his seat, feeling slightly embarrassed but grateful at the same time. "I've had a lot of help along the way. You've been a big part of that. I don't think I'd be the same without the encouragement you gave me." Mr. Thompson smiled warmly. "I just gave you the space to believe in yourself. You did the hard work. And that's what's important." Jamal nodded thoughtfully. "It's funny how, for so long, I thought I needed to be perfect. I thought that if I didn't get straight A's or win every competition, I'd be a failure. But this year, I realized that the real victory isn't the grade or the trophy. It's being able to learn from everything and just keep moving forward. That's the truth, Mr. Thompson said with a proud nod. And I think you're just getting started. There's so much ahead of you, Jamal, and I know that whatever you decide to do, you'll continue to inspire people. Not because of your grades or your genius IQ, but because of your heart. Jamal was quiet for a moment, letting Mr. Thompson's words sink in. He hadn't fully realized it until then, but what he had been searching for wasn't the validation of others. It was the internal peace that came with self-acceptance. That peace had taken time to find, and it had been a long road, but it was worth every step. As the afternoon wore on, Jamal and Mr. Thompson continued to chat about the future, about Jamal's dreams of studying engineering, and about the possibilities that lay ahead. For the first time, Jamal didn't feel pressure to have everything figured out. He was content knowing that he would take things one day at a time, trusting himself and the people around him to guide him when needed. Later that evening, Jamal found himself sitting on the porch of his house, watching the sunset. The colors of the sky shifted from shades of orange to deep purple as the night began to settle in. He felt at peace, truly at peace for the first time in a long time. As his mind wandered back to everything he had experienced over the past year, he thought about how he had overcome so many challenges. He had struggled with self-doubt, trying to live up to impossible standards. He had faced moments of insecurity, unsure of his place in the world. But with each challenge, he had grown stronger, more confident in who he was. The summer had brought him clarity. Senior year would be the next chapter, and Jamal felt ready to step into it, not with the weight of expectations, but with the wisdom he had gained from his journey so far. His phone buzzed again, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was Aaliyah, as usual, with a simple text, "Hey, you're going to crush senior year. I know it. Let's go out for ice cream tomorrow. We'll celebrate everything, even if it's just making it through this year." Jamal laughed, shaking his head at how she always knew exactly what he needed to hear. He quickly typed back, "Sounds perfect. Let's do it." As he hit send, he realized that the real journey had only just begun. Senior year was going to bring new challenges, new growth, and new victories. And this time, Jamal wasn't going to face it alone. He had the support of his family, his friends, and, most importantly, he had himself. For the first time in his life, Jamal truly understood what it meant to be enough. Senior year had arrived. The start of the year was filled with the usual excitement, the promise of a fresh beginning, the anticipation of college applications, and the looming uncertainty of what came next. Jamal had seen many of his classmates throw themselves into their final year with a combination of energy and nerves. They were determined to make it count, to finish strong, but there was something different about Jamal this year. He no longer felt that overwhelming pressure to prove himself. Instead, he was focused on making the most of the time he had left, taking the lessons he had learned and applying them to the challenges ahead. It was the first day of school, and Jamal sat at his usual spot in Mr. Thompson's class, staring at the syllabus on his desk. Senior year would be a test of his academic abilities, but more importantly, it would be a test of his character. He'd been so focused on grades for so long that he'd almost forgotten about the other aspects of his education, the relationships he built, the mistakes he learned from, and the wisdom he'd gained. As the bell rang and Mr. Thompson entered the classroom, the room settled into a quiet hum of anticipation. Jamal looked around, noticing the familiar faces. Aaliyah was seated to his left, smiling at him with the same understanding that she always had. She was a constant source of comfort, and he knew they'd continue to face this final year together, side by side. Mr. Thompson cleared his throat and began the class, as usual, but there was something different about him today. There was a weight in his voice, a sense of gravitas that made everyone stop and listen. "Welcome back, everyone," Mr. Thompson began, his eyes scanning the room. "This year is going to be one of the most important years of your lives. For many of you, it's a year of transition. You'll be preparing to leave high school, stepping out into the world and making decisions that will shape your future. But I want to remind you of something: grades are only a small part of your education. It's your character, your resilience, and your heart that will truly define who you become. Jamal leaned forward, intrigued by Mr. Thompson's words. He hadn't expected this kind of talk on the first day of school. Most teachers went straight into the curriculum, but Mr. Thompson had always been different. His emphasis on personal growth, on becoming a better person, had been one of the things that had inspired Jamal the most. As you approach the next chapter in your lives, Mr. Thompson continued, don't lose sight of the most important lesson you'll ever learn. Success is not measured by the grades you get or the awards you win. It's measured by how you handle failure, by how you respond to adversity, and by how you treat others along the way. Every challenge you face is an opportunity to grow. Jamal sat back, reflecting on Mr. Thompson's words. He had learned that lesson the hard way. The fear of failure, the obsession with validation, had consumed him for so long. But now, with each passing day, he was more and more convinced that true success wasn't about the accolades, it was about how you overcame the obstacles and kept moving forward. After class, Jamal and Aaliyah walked to the cafeteria together, talking about their plans for the year. You know, Jamal, Aaliyah said thoughtfully, I've been thinking about what Mr. Thompson said. It's crazy how much we put on ourselves to be perfect. But we can't forget about the things that matter most, the relationships, the lessons we learn, and how we grow as people. Jamal nodded. Yeah, I think I'm finally starting to get it. I used to think that everything had to be about the grades, about proving I was the smartest in the room. But now I realize that those things are just small pieces of the bigger picture. What really matters is how we treat people and how we stay true to ourselves. Aaliyah smiled. Exactly. And I think you figured that out. You're not the same person who came into this school a few years ago. You've grown so much. Jamal felt a warmth in his chest at Aaliyah's words. He had grown, but it wasn't just because of the grades or the awards. It was because of the moments of vulnerability, the struggles, and the support he had received from the people around him. Aaliyah, his family, Mr. Thompson, each of them had played a role in helping him see who he truly was. As the year went on, Jamal found that his focus shifted away from grades and accomplishments and more toward the people who mattered most to him. He spent more time with his family, appreciating the little moments of connection. He strengthened his friendships, learning to open up more and share his thoughts and feelings. He embraced his passion for science without the need for recognition, pursuing it for the love of discovery. When the time came to submit his college applications, Jamal approached them with a new mindset. Instead of worrying about whether he would get in, he focused on being honest and true to who he was. He wrote his personal statement about his journey, his struggles, his triumphs, and the lessons he had learned along the way. It wasn't just about his academic achievements, it was about the person he had become. As the school year came to a close, Jamal found himself sitting once again in Mr. Thompson's class, but this time it was different. The end of the year felt like a natural conclusion to the journey he had begun. His final grades weren't the most important thing to him anymore. What mattered most was how he had changed, how he had grown, and how he had learned to embrace the ups and downs of life. I just want to say one last thing, Mr. Thompson said on the final day of class, his voice soft but steady. You all have incredible potential. But potential means nothing unless you take the time to understand who you are and what you truly want from life. Don't let anyone or anything dictate your worth. You are enough, just as you are. Jamal felt a deep sense of gratitude toward Mr. Thompson. The lessons he had imparted had shaped him into someone he could be proud of. And now, as he looked toward the future, Jamal felt ready. He wasn't perfect, and he didn't have all the answers, but he was confident in one thing: he was enough. As he walked out of the classroom for the last time, Jamal didn't just feel the weight of the school year lifting. He felt like he was stepping into the world, not as someone trying to prove himself, but as someone who had finally accepted who he was. The journey wasn't over. It had only just begun. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?